Well, welcome to the Bring Your Own Carrier session for voice. We're really excited to have you here today, so thanks for coming. My name is Annie Benitez. I'm the Director of Product for SIP Connectivity here at Twilio, and I'm joined on stage by Bill Harrison, also part of the product management team for SIP. We've both been here at Twilio for about 5 years now, so we're really excited to be talking to you about this. We are going to be opening the session up for pilots. So if you want to pilot their BYOC connectivity, if you do, go to slido.com, type in the code #BYOC, and just put in your details, and we'll talk to that at the end as well. So first of all, for our agenda, we're going to say, why did we decide to build Bring Your Own Carrier for voice? Bill will go over how it works. He'll give you a sneak peek of the console experience that we're building for this particular product. And then we'll show you how to get started and open it up for questions if we have time at the end. So why did we decide to bring your own carrier for SIP in general, for voice? When we were talking to customers, we realized through the sales process that we've encountered customers that wanted to start to use Twilio, especially for our programmability capabilities, to make better product experiences for their customers. So essentially, they wanted the flexibility and the programmability of Twilio, but there was a really big hurdle when they actually said, but you actually need to use Twilio Super Network for our connectivity, and that was a pretty big hurdle for a variety of reasons. So we realized that some of our customers were ready to use Twilio, but they were just not ready to use our connectivity yet, and that was a blocking point for us. So we wanted to really unleash those and decouple those. And the reason why it was painful to start using our Super Network connectivity was primarily because porting is risky and painful in some countries more than others. We also realized that a lot of customers just have long-standing relationships and contracts with Tier 1 carriers for their connectivity, and breaking those is usually pretty hard, or it might not be the right timing as well. They also might have an investment in infrastructure deployed in their session border controllers and their pretty much call servers or things of the like that they were not ready to deprecate it. So again, the timing might not be ideal to actually use Twilio with our connectivity, but using Twilio without our connectivity would actually be just fine. We also ran into customers that wanted to use different carriers around the world. So for example, they might have a carrier that they really want in the region that they're operating business. So if they were in the UK, they might want to use, say, Colt or British Telecom for their carrier. But for US calls, they might want to use Twilio Super Network. So we wanted to also give that flexibility for our customers. So at the end of the day, we realized we really have two types of users. Within our single customers, you have our developer users that want to use the Twilio's programming language. And then you also have the telco user that wants to use our connectivity or might not want to use our connectivity. And those two teams tend to move at very different speeds. So we wanted to essentially give our customers the choice to say, use programmability, but don't use our connectivity yet until you're actually ready to start using it. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bill to talk about our deployment models.
Thanks, Annie. Hi, I'm Bill, again, on Annie's team with here at Twilio. I want to talk to you about the different models that we're talking about that would be good fits for Bring Your Own Carrier. So basically, there's two basic deployment models we'd be talking about here. The first one would be the connection with an on-premise SBC. So the customer has their own SIP infrastructure, and they have an SBC on-premise. The second one would be direct connections to their providers. So we'll explore both of them in a little more detail. The first one, the connection via an on-premise SBC. As you can see here on the slide, it would be a customer. They have a corporate network with their own SIP infrastructure, and they have their own providers as well who were routing calls into their network. And then what they could do to add Twilio in that case is they could have an SBC on the edge that can route those calls to Twilio using a fully qualified domain name, as you can see there, the sip.us.twilio.com address. And that can go over a public internet or private connection. So we currently have that available right now via our programmable voice SIP interfaces. The second example, that we'd be looking at would be that direct connection to the provider. So this would be where the customer, they still have their on-premise SIP infrastructure, but they don't want to take care of those calls. They don't want to forward the calls to Twilio via an SBC. So then we would arrange with that provider a connection where they would send the calls there to the customer's numbers to go directly to Twilio. And again, that would be, in this case, via a SIP request to an FQDN, and basically the same thing. We could use our programmable voice SIP interfaces. But there's one small kind of corner connection where we want to add it in this regard, is that some providers, either by choice or by they can't do it, don't want to send their traffic to a fully qualified domain name. And in that case, what we're doing with BYOC is we're adding an IP address, and that's going to be over a private connection. So what we're going to do is leverage that private connection to be able to connect the calls directly from the carrier into Twilio via that private IP address. As you can see, it's the same phone number, it's just going to a specific private IP address. So that's the only real big difference there. And that's coming soon as part of Bring Your Own Carrier. So you're looking at that and you're saying, Bill, that's all great. How does it work? So let's go into the different scenarios that we're talking about for how it works here. And what we're talking about, basically, it's fairly simple. A Bring Your Own Carrier trunk has to handle traffic in two directions. Termination, which is traffic coming into Twilio, and origination, which is traffic coming out of Twilio. What comes in, we want to go out, we're going from the carrier, we're going to the carrier. Fairly simple. As you can see, simplest model you can possibly have. Provider, across a private connection to Twilio, and then Twilio does all the Twilio magic that we normally do on a day-to-day basis. So what we're looking at there, that's inbound traffic. There's not much to configure, it's pretty simple. You're gonna create your own trunk. You can configure a webhook just like you do with a Twilio number or a Twilio SIP domain. And then you're basically just gonna go in and you're gonna create a termination SIP domain to tell basically, okay, this is where the carrier is gonna send their traffic to. You can enable a static IP address and then basically authenticate based on the IP address on the other side of the connection. So the IP address of the provider, the IP address at Twilio, connection, it's a trunk, the traffic comes in. So once that's happening, the carrier is going to be able to just send that traffic to that SIP URI, and it'll hit Twilio. Twilio will make its normal webhook call and do all the Twiml magic that we do. The requirement here for that IP address, again, is the private connection through Twilio Interconnect, and then basically we need to have a source IP address from the carrier to identify the trunk. So pretty simple. Other direction, outbound traffic from Twilio, it's pretty simple as well. This is trunking, so there's not much to it. It's gonna come out from Twilio, go across the connection, and get to the provider. How do we do that? Well, you're gonna configure an OCP. What's an OCP? OCP is a TLA for origination connection policy. Who knows what a TLA is? It's a three-letter acronym for three-letter acronym. So basically what you're going to be doing is then you're going to configure an OCP. That OCP is going to contain a list of targets that go to that carrier, and that carrier is going to then accept the traffic at those targets. And what we can do there is we can put them in a list of up to 10, and we can assign priority and weight so you can do failover, load balancing, et cetera, between those targets. And once those are set up, it's a simple dial. Your plain old Twilio dial verb, we added a little parameter, BYOC, to select the trunk that you just set up, and you dial, you give it the trunk, and out it goes to your provider. And what we can have on top of that is we can also have a recursion to Twilio's super network in case those calls fail. Okay? So that's all great. The console is going to have to adjust for that, so we'll give you a little sneak peek as to what the console is going to look like going forward. And we have to basically take into account what we talked about before, termination, origination, and then in the future we're talking about adding some registered numbers. That's a little future sneak for that. So then we want to basically bring all of our SIP products in under the same console area, so it's a nice, even, simple experience for our customers. So the three would be the BYOC we're talking about now, and then the existing two we have now, Elastic SIP Trunking and our programmable SIP interfaces. So the console will look basically like this. We'll have the three products in the same area, and as you can see, BYOC is right in the middle there. If you click on the BYOC, it'll take you to the page where it lists all your trunks. As you can see, all the trunks are listed there nice and neat, and the SIP components are under there. If you click on the trunk, you'll see the things I just talked about. You'll see that there's the general properties where you can give it a name, termination, origination, and then the application webhook that we talked about. So you give it that information, give it your webhook. You want to configure termination, so you click there, and you can add your termination SIP domains. And that's basically the domain you're giving the carrier to send traffic to. You put in your source IP addresses as an ACL. You can also put in credentials for authentication if you'd like. Once that's done, configure your origination. As you can see, we've got 5 different origination targets here. You can have up to 10. They're all set up, I believe, with equal weights, so that's load balancing. Or you could change the weights and have failover. And then once you're done with that, everything is all set. So you might be saying, Bill, how do I get started with this? This all sounds great. I'll hand it back to Annie so she can tell you how.
Cool. Thanks, Bill.
Yep.
So we have a pilot starting in September. If you're interested in participating in the pilot, please sign up. Go to slido.com from your handhelds and just type in the code #BYOC. We'll just need your full name and email and anything else you want to tell us. Pricing itself. So we're going to be charging this per minute, and it's going to be a flat rate for both inbound and outbound per minute at 0.004 per minute. And let me talk to you about kind of like what's coming in future phases after the pilot. So there's two main things that we're going to be building. The one thing is actually facilitating the outbound dialing plans and routing. And this is actually going to be very cool because we realize in cases you might want to have one or multiple BYOC providers en route, and you might also want to be using Twilio Super Network. So we want to add console configuration capabilities to say, for example, if you want to dial +44, you might want to route that call always to your BYOC provider. So in this case, it might be British Telecom. But you might want to say, for example, anything that goes to a +1 in the US, I might want to route it to using Twilio Super Network. So there will be an area in the console where you configure routing with essentially country prefixes, and we might make it a little bit of country prefixes and maybe like NPA, NXX type of deal as well. So I think this is going to be really powerful because what happens is your dial verb is then going to become just dial and the phone number. You won't even have to have a BYOC provider sit in that dial. So it's going to be a more seamless experience from a development perspective as well. The second thing that we want to do is have registered phone numbers. And the reason you might want to do this is right now in the pilot, when you're going to have your traffic coming into Twilio from your BYOC provider, all the calls to all of the phone numbers on your BYOC provider are going to hit exactly the same webhook URL. So if there's anything specific you want to be doing on a per phone number basis, that's going to have to be built into your application today. So in the future, we want to actually have you register your phone numbers on Twilio, and then you can have individual webhooks URLs per phone numbers that you might want to invoke for those particular phone numbers themselves. The other thing that's going to give you is going to give you just things like you have on our phone numbers APIs to like query call logs and query phone numbers availability. You'll just have more flexibility doing that with APIs when you actually have your phone numbers registered on Twilio. So these are some of the things that are going to be coming in 2020 from a development standpoint. So to close it off, essentially, we wanted to bring your own carrier for trunking for voice to give our customers choice to say, you don't have to port all your numbers to be able to start using Twilio, so an ability for you to get started faster without having to use our connectivity. We wanted to give you the option to use our super network either as a failover option or whenever you're ready to actually move that over. And we wanted to just make that decision up to our customers. So essentially, it's about removing obstacle and just giving you the choice. So with that, I believe we have a few minutes for Q&A. I'll leave this light up in case people want to sign up for the pilot, but I'll open it up to questions from the audience if there's anything that anybody might want to ask. And it's a little bit hard to see, so if I can't see your hand, just yell out at us, please. Yeah.
So I apologize, I came in a couple minutes late, so hopefully you didn't already cover this. So you said for pricing it was going to be 0.004 for the minutes going through. So that's already the normal price for Elastic-SIP, right? So if you were going to do this, would you essentially be paying double? You'd be paying the Twilio side and whatever you're currently paying the current carrier?
So to answer the first part of the question, yes, the pricing is the same pricing as we have for SIP interfaces, so it would just be the 004 per minute. But yes, that would be in addition to whatever you're currently paying your current carrier.
So the advantage of doing that over just porting is just being able to access stuff right away.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And given that we're still in pilot mode, this is sort of like our first pricing determination. We might change that as we learn from our pilot and our customers, sort of like as we gain feedback if the price is right or not. So between pilot and GA, the pricing might change slightly, but yes. There was another question, yeah.
What are some of the use cases you've seen with BYOC? You mentioned maybe some people don't want to port their numbers or something, but are these contact centers that
It's really interesting. I'm seeing a mix of two. So we're seeing either large contact centers or large enterprises. And I'm seeing the case where they have large tier 1 providers. And it's less about resistance to use Twilio Super Network, but it's just the timing isn't right, or they want to do it in phases. So it's kind of like they might have either an AT&T or a Verizon or a British Telecom, so like a major carrier. And they say, I don't want to move that yet. I just want to use Twilio's programmability. And then on the flip side, what we see today is customers that are already using SIP interfaces that are using smaller providers, like tier 2, tier 3s. So I'm seeing things like Bandwidth, we're seeing things like IntelliPeer, Voxbone, and even some of our competitors as well, like ThinkU or Telnix as well. So it's kind of like the two extremes. Yes.
Is this something you could do? So the example you just gave of maybe they're not ready to do it all right away. Could you sort of say, hey, we're going to try this next Monday, and then have all calls sort of route through Twilio to see if, hey, is it working? Do people like it? Is the experience the same? And then maybe turn it off, just have it for like a limited test period.
Yeah, so the really cool thing is it's the same dial verb. So the only thing that you need to change to use the kind of like the BYOC, well, let me back up. The first thing to use the BYOC provider is you have to actually configure that provider itself. So that's kind of like what Bill talked us through. But then to actually use them, it's either just the dial verb to just say add the BYOC provider SID. You can either add it or remove it on your webhook. So that should be a fairly simple change to do. And then for the inbound, it might be a little bit trickier, but that's kind of like configuration on your BYOC carrier. But then from that perspective, it's kind of like it should probably just be a simple switch to say either route it to your current SBC or route it directly to Twilio, for example.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That would be. I would think it would be more on the provider end to work with them as to whether they could point it to us or point it to the existing infrastructure that you have. But yeah, on the outbound, from our perspective, it would be a simple code change of changing the BYOs, either putting in the BYOC or taking it out to see whether it used our network or the BYOC network that was on there. So it's really where the calls are originating from is what that decision would have to be made.
Yes, one question over here.
What are some of the prerequisites for the carrier side for outgoing BYOC work?
So
Can it be supported by all carriers or are there
no, this is so the question is kind of like what are the prerequisites for the BYOC carrier to actually leverage this? And this is where it actually gets very tricky in terms of like every carrier is different and they each have like their own nuances. So ideally, if they can send traffic to an FQDN, that would be the easiest way, and you can get started using SIP interface. The next challenge that I see is they can't use an FQDN, so they require an IP address. So that's kind of what we are enabling with this. But the one requirement we have is if they want to use an IP address, it has to be a globally unique IP address.
Yeah.
So it has to be globally unique not only per carrier, but per carrier and per customer. So that's like the main requisite, and typically that's the main blocker. I don't know, have you heard of anything else, Bill? Or
I haven't heard of a big one. The biggest thing there is whether the carrier is able to give a unique IP address per customer if they have multiple customers. In the case where it's the FQDN, that's more whether they can reach that, because that one there, there'd be a different domain that they'd be using, so we could differentiate based on the domain. So I don't think there'd be many other restrictions. It's more talking to the carrier and asking them, hey, can you reach that domain with your traffic? And if not, can you reach this IP address from a globally unique IP address? Those are the two biggest qualifiers, one or the other.
But it's probably worth adding. I expect we're going to leave the BYOC trunking in pilot for a fair amount of, for several months, mainly to go through that learning experience with the different carriers. And once we have different interconnections with a variety of carriers, it'll be an easier experience for the next customer that signs up with the same carrier. Or at least that is what we're working towards.
Anyone else? Yes. Yes. It's a slight difference. So what they'd be using now to do that would be the programmable voice SIP interface, which you can do now. That's currently and using the dial. It's just and using the existing Twilio tools. It wouldn't have the BYOC carrier for going out in that case. So you wouldn't be able to do a dial BYOC. You'd have to do it as a SIP dial to the carrier, and they'd have to give you a SIP interface, a SIP IP address that would be accepting calls. In this case, what we're trying to do is we're putting it under one carrier. You configure your inbound URI, you configure your outbound URIs, and then you can just point the traffic at that carrier. And so that's the main difference. Yep. Well, it's hard to see.
Are there any other questions out there? I'm not seeing.
No.
Yes. No, yeah, so we're planning to launch this globally, but initially, like the current customers that we're talking to at the moment are both European-based and US-based. But if you're in any other region around the world, we're more than happy to kind of like talk to you and have it enabled because there shouldn't be any, like there's no limitations as long as we launch the rules in all the regions, which we're planning to do. So there's no limitations that we've architected in from a regional perspective. Yeah. Any other questions? So I think with that, we'll call it a wrap, but I want to encourage everybody to stay to the next session. It's a SIP SIP connectivity panel with some of our best customers. We have 6 customers that are participating, which should be pretty cool. And if anybody's interested in the pilot or any other follow-up questions, Bill and I are around all day. And thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much.